So Cosmic Skeptic, an incredible vegan activist who's done wonders for the community, has recently made a video on his position on animals' right to life. Cosmic Skeptic does remain vegan in this discussion, arguing that animals should be considered in the same way as humans, although I think the conclusions he reaches are false. Let's break down the video and talk about whether an animal does or does not have the right to life.
Part of the problem is the way that the word vegan is defined. It's defined in so many different ways depending on the context. For instance, if food is described as vegan, it will usually just mean food that doesn't contain any animal products. But if a person is defined as vegan, it's someone who doesn't eat those kinds of food. But if someone is an ethical vegan, then it's somebody who maybe seeks to minimize animal suffering. But if someone's an environmental vegan, then you see the point. There are like hundreds of different ways to define this term.
There is no such thing as a health vegan, there is no such thing as an environmental vegan, and there is actually no such thing as an ethical vegan. In reality, all vegans are ethical vegans. Veganism is an ethical stance, and that means that it entails considerations of other lifestyle changes which do not factor in to the consideration of the environment or your health. For example, leather. Leather does not necessarily harm your health, but vegans would avoid it. Another thing to consider is hunting. Hunting is not necessarily environmentally unsustainable if done in small amounts, yet would be unvegan because it causes harm to animals. Veganism is and must always be considered an ethical movement, and it's something that we should gatekeep.
I've always used a definition quite similar to the vegan societies, that veganism, ethical veganism as I see it, is a minimization to the highest extent practicable of all forms of animal suffering. Now, the vegan society includes the term exploitation. I think this is potentially quite a vague and unhelpful term because it itself is a term that has myriad definitions. So I'll stick with suffering.
I actually really love the vegan society definition, and I'm glad Alex uses it because I think it is a very good definition. I know that some people disagree with me on this, but I'm happy to defend it. I think that the vegan society definition as it stands should be left as it is.
Interesting thing about the definition that I've given here, a minimization of animal suffering, is that as long as the animal doesn't suffer, it would seem that whatever you're doing accords with this definition of veganism. So there's some argument to be made that if you did have an animal who lived a perfectly good life, potentially a net positive life, so it's a good thing that they came into existence, and then you killed them genuinely painlessly, that not only is this something that you're kind of allowed to do to not be a vegan, but according to this definition of veganism, that would be a vegan thing to do because it wouldn't be causing any animal suffering.
Because, Alex, the way that you've changed the definition is what causes the problems. Exploitation is pretty easy to understand. It is the use of another individual rather than their equal treatment. So Kant would define exploitation as treating an individual as a means to an end rather than an end in themselves, and I think that this is most appropriate for this definition. I think that the consideration, equal consideration of animals requires the equal consideration of their interests in ethical judgments. And so the notion of exploitation is fundamental for their consideration. And you'll find that you do this time and time again, Alex. You'll say, wait a minute, if we replace animals and humans in this, is that a justified conclusion? And the reason you are doing so is because you realize that we treat individual humans as ends in themselves, whilst we treat animals, atypically in society, as means to an end. And so replacing animals and humans allows us to make sure that we are treating animals as an end in themselves.
I think a potentially more helpful way to think about this is to substitute in a human being. If you're ever having trouble overcoming some kind of vegan ethical dilemma, it's often helpful to put human beings in the same position as the animals and see what your ethical intuitions tell you, at least on first glance. Now, most people's ethical intuitions scream that, of course, there's something wrong with this, although utilitarianism has traditionally been quite a difficult theory to reconcile with this intuition that most of us share, that this would be wrong, because how can it be wrong if morality is just about minimizing suffering and this person's death doesn't cause any suffering? So if you want to say that, yeah, you'd be fine with killing that person in the cabin in the woods, then hey, you're being consistent, so you've got that going for you. But I think most people would want to listen to their intuitions to at least some extent and say, well, I'm convinced that it's wrong to kill a human being in that context, even if it causes causes no suffering. So maybe suffering isn't the only metric involved. And in that case, if you have an animal and you're killing it, even if there's no suffering involved, there might still be a problem with that. I just think we need to be consistent.
When you replace animals and humans and you rely upon intuitions, you are relying upon something ungrounded. You are relying upon how you feel rather than any form of argumentation. You can't necessarily go, well, wait a minute, is this wrong from a utilitarian standpoint? If it's right from a utilitarian standpoint, then you must accept it as a utilitarian or reject your normative ethic. This is why I would recommend questioning your normative framework.
To apply a concept like the right to life to non-human animals, I'm not even sure that it can practically work. The reason for that is that we might think that it's wrong to kill non-human animals, or that we should minimize it as much as we can, that it's generally a bad thing, fine. But if you have a right to something, that implies a level of inviolability. That's what distinguishes a right from other kinds of moral prescriptions, is that if you have a right to something, you essentially have an inviolable claim over that thing. And it doesn't matter what the other circumstances are, this thing doesn't get violated. That's what a right is.
A right does not necessarily imply inviolability. It implies inalienability, at least some degree. I would say that a right should not be violated, that we ought not trespass upon the subjectivity of another, but this relies upon an ethical system and a rule of law which allows for certain exceptions to occur. I know that in this you say, Alex, that, well, wait a minute, well, we could have specificationism and then point towards individual circumstance where this right would not apply. I actually don't think this is necessary even in this scenario.
Down phrase, the right to life. So here's the problem with trying to grant that kind of inviolability, that right to life to non-human animals. As things currently stand, and this might not be the case in principle, I'm not really sure, I wouldn't want to say either way, but certainly in practice, it is currently impossible, it's not possible to avoid killing animals in the production of food for human sustenance, right? Now, of course, we can eat plants, but do bear in mind that growing plants, all plant-based agriculture, involves animal death, not just from pesticides and habitat destruction, but also like the effect of transporting food, the environmental costs, all of this kind of stuff. It involves a lot of animal deaths, is what I'm trying to say. Now, of course, the vegan response to this is to say that, yes, growing plants kills some animals, but a lot more crops, a lot more plants are used to feed livestock than to feed human beings. So if we're trying to minimize the amount of animal suffering we're responsible for, we can either grow some crops, which does kill some animals, and then eat those crops, or grow even more crops, killing even more animals, to then feed those crops to livestock, to then kill those animals, to eat those animals. And it's clear which is going to contribute least to animal suffering and death.
It's true that many vegans, and even myself, will retort at times when people say, well, look at crop deaths. You kill animals to produce crops. We will retort, well, no, we would kill more animals to produce crops, to feed to animals, to then kill those animals. It's the trophic pyramid. We have to kill more animals in crop deaths alone before we even reach the point of killing the livestock, because we need more energy to produce the cows, the chickens, and the pigs, from which we will then slaughter. And this is a good retort. But another retort is that we aren't intentionally killing these animals. These are accidental deaths which we are seeking to avoid. And I mean seeking to avoid. Vegans are against crop deaths if we can avoid them. We are actively looking for solutions for crop deaths. If you look at the work of Earthlin Ed, he is looking at alternative forms of agriculture to minimize the amount of lives taken in the production of crops. He's looking at things like vertical farming. And even if you are not a fan of vertical farming, other vegans are looking at alternative forms of farming which don't use pesticides. Veganic farming, for example. There are numerous vegan movements set up to reduce crop deaths because we recognize that we ought respect the right to life of animals simpliciter. This includes the ones in crop production. However, we also have the obligation to feed ourselves and sustain ourselves in order to even engage in this ethical conversation.
Think of human rights, like the right to life in a human context. If the only way that I could get food in order to stop myself from starving was to go and kill another person, legally or morally, I don't think this can be justified. There might be some ethical theories, certainly like egoism, almost certainly would say so. But I think most people's, at least their ethical intuitions, would say that I don't get to go and murder somebody because it's the only way to feed me. Even if it means I starve, that doesn't mean I have the right to go and take someone else's life. Why? Well, potentially because they have this thing called the right to life. They have a right that I can't violate, even if it means that I'm going to starve to death. Let's say I need to murder them to steal their food or something like that. This isn't something we think is justified. If we were to apply that right to life to non-human animals, then now consider the animals that are killed in crop production.
What we can point towards in this scenario is what is called the rule of double effect. Now, you point towards a scenario in which, well, if a human must kill an animal to survive, its right to life no longer applies. This is absolutely false. So what the rule of double effect teaches us is that at times when we have conflicting duties, we should choose the duty which is the highest order. That means the duty which we are most bound to, that which we are most obligated or obliged to respect. This comes at points in which we have no choice but to respect one duty over another. For example, if an individual attacks you in the street and you have to defend yourself, do they have the right to life? Of course they do. But you have the right to self-defense. You have the right to life. It's not that they no longer have the right to life. It's that in respecting your right to life, in respecting your greater obligation to your right to life and your right to self-defense, that you are unfortunately forced to end their life, unless it can be avoided. And this is why we have use of force laws. You're not allowed to kill someone simply because they attack you. You have to use reasonable force, if possible, to deter the attacker or prevent them from harming you without using lethal force when necessary. You do not need to negate the right to life of an animal in order to respect your own right to life, which may lead to the animal's death.
We'd have to say the same kind of thing. We'd have to say, if the only way for me to eat is to kill all of these animals, then I just can't eat because they have a right to life that cannot be violated. They're not threatening me in any way or anything like this. I'm going over to them and killing them in order to produce food to feed myself. So if they have a right to life, it means I can't do that. What does that mean? It means humankind will starve because, as I say, as things currently stand, we can definitely minimize animal death and suffering by eating plants, but we can't eliminate it. We can't get rid of animal death in even just plant-based agriculture. So if they had this right to life in the same way that humans do, we'd be in big trouble.
And if you are being consistent here, Alex, you would come to the conclusion that because of agriculture causing deaths of humans, if we all have a right to life, then agriculture itself would be impossible. Driving cars would be impossible. Operating anything in society would be impossible. Agriculture is especially bad, being the most dangerous primary industry within the UK. Many deaths, not just caused from interaction with animals, but also from farm equipment itself, which is incredibly dangerous. Do we have the right to life if farmers die during crop production, Alex? Should we negate the human right to life? If you are going to be against rights itself and a rights-based approach, make that clear. Explain why you're against it, rather than say that an animal could not have the right to life.
The problem. Think of human rights, like the right to life in a human context. If the only way that I could get food in order to stop myself from starving was to go and kill another person, legally or morally, I don't think this can be justified.
But there are numerous examples in history in which people have used extreme measures, for example, killing another individual to sustain themselves, and yet they have not went to prison. This is exactly the reason why if a vegan is on a desert island, yes, he can eat a pig. And this is exactly why I will say, if I'm on a desert island and it's me and somebody else, well then I'm sorry, but it's also somebody else. This isn't because I don't think they have the right to life. And this isn't because I wouldn't respect their right to life if I could respect it. If I could sustain myself on this island with them and we could mutually survive, then we ought do so. But if not, then we are in a state of war. And normal ethics does not apply. Our rights are 100% based upon our institutions and our engagements with each other, our ability to satisfy our system of drives. In fact, this is why we have conflictions in duties when rights come into conflict. If I have a right to feed myself, but I'm in a society which is making me starve, then I am obligated to steal. But I'm also obligated to not steal because you have a right to private property. This is a tragic scenario, and this is what ethics seeks to overcome in our society. When we have to violate the rights of one individual to respect the rights of another, we can see that there must be some sort of institutional change that needs to be made in order to resolve and cease this conflict. And this is how ethics progress within a Hegelian institutional format. And it's worth noting that Hegel wrote the book The Philosophy of Right. Right in German meaning legal rights. This whole philosophy is about abstract right and natural right, the right he believes is entailed in our very being.
So you could just say that the non-human animal's right to life is a different kind of right to life to a human being. Maybe in a human context, I'm allowed to kill you only if you're threatening me, but in a non-human context, I'm allowed to kill you just if it's necessary for me to survive, or something like this. But if you're going to do that, then you're going to have to offer an analysis of rights that explains why one creature has this kind of right and one creature has this kind of right. And I think it also muddies the term right to life and makes it vague and essentially something that changes depending on who it applies to. The whole point of having this system of rights is that, for instance, in human rights, the idea is that if you're a human, you have this right. That's it. No questions asked.
The same right to life applies. If it's necessary for survival and it means that we have to fight and kill each other to survive, I think that we are justified in doing so. And this is not controversial. This has happened throughout history. If we're being honest with ourselves, if our society had some sort of catastrophic level event, doomsday apocalypse, zombie apocalypse level event in which no supplies are available, the only supplies exist in the hands of a few people who will not share them, and we are forced to take action in order to survive, we are absolutely justified in doing so. I would not argue that this was the same as being a murderer in a normal context. Clearly, the social scenario is different. Clearly, the normal ethical rules of society are breaking down. This is an extreme, and this has no applicability upon whether we can respect the right to life of an individual within our normal contemporary society. Just as if we have the option to respect an animal's right to life in terms of crop production, we ought to do so. We should be looking for modes of farming to replace our current means of farming to reduce crop deaths.
So I don't really think it's probably a helpful thing to do to argue that animals have a right to life, certainly not in the way that humans do. I think it's better to say something like they have a right to avoid or to not have inflicted upon them unnecessary or wanton suffering. I think that's a much easier position to defend and would be consistent with our views regarding human beings.
Ironically, Alex, I don't think that this is an easier position to defend, precisely for the reason that you are pushed in the debate with Armin Navabadi to concede that killing an animal would be justified so long as it didn't suffer and no other animals witnessed it being killed. This is something I absolutely disagree with, and in my debate with Armin Navabadi presented a position in which considered the right to life of the animal and considered its interests within a narrative framework. Just because an animal's not self-conscious, just because an animal doesn't think towards the future, doesn't mean its future doesn't matter. Because it has a right to life. Because its life is valuable inherently. So Alex, although I appreciate the video, I think you've totally misunderstood what rights actually entail. Rights aren't inviolable. In fact, they're inalienable. Even from an individualist approach like yourself, where you're coming from maybe as a liberal standpoint, rights can be violated and trespassed upon so long as they're compensated. Robert Nozick talks about this in relation to the principle of compensation and the right to property. Our rights can be violated under certain circumstances. This doesn't mean that rights don't exist. It just means that we can have obligations which supersede our obligations to other rights at times. This is ultimately to respect what is right. What is right is what is rational and reasonable to do. And sometimes that means resolving a conflict between two duties on one duty alone and having to consider that over another duty. I consider my right to life before I consider an animal's right to life, or before I consider the right to life of a random stranger who's attacking me. This is where we're at, and this is what rights are about, and this is how rights are legally established. Alex, if you ever want to have a conversation about this, or if you want to have a discussion or anything, and you find any of my positions wanting, you know I always welcome it, and I hope you, the audience, have learned why animal rights are not negated because of crop production, or animal rights are not negated because of contexts, which may mean we need to respect one duty over another. Human rights and animal rights are identical in this, and I hope this has been made clear. Thank you to all my Gold Soul patrons on Patreon for making this possible. It would not be done without you guys. Thank you for watching, and as always, try to gain some perspective.